People in ancient Greece did not live as well as we imagined. They lived with gnawing hunger, cooking scraps in silence while dreaming of bread they couldn't afford. But from the edge of starvation, the ancient Greeks used their ingenious inventiveness to come up with dishes that helped them stay alive. While modern minds envision ancient Greece through the marble glow of temples and the polished words of philosophers, the truth is that most people in that world lived in cramped homes with dirt floors, under leaking roofs, surrounded by bare cupboards, and hunted constantly by the fear of famine. They weren't thinking about logic or democracy. They were thinking about what they'd feed their children tomorrow, if anything at all. Food was not evenly shared. The land belonged to the wealthy. The olive groves, grain fields, and cattle were theirs, protected by laws and swords. Everyone else, the shepherd, the widow, the tenant farmer, lived from harvest to harvest, drought to drought, praying the rains would come and the storage jars wouldn't run dry before spring. When winter stretched too long or invaders burned the fields, even the smallest scraps became precious. And it was in this bleak, relentless hunger that some of the simplest, cheapest meals in history were born. One of the most important was called kaikion. To us, it might sound strange or even disgusting, just a thin gruel made by boiling crushed barley in water or wine, often flavored with pennyroyal or other herbs from the roadside. There was no sweetness in it, no meat, no fat, no warmth beyond the bowl's steam. And yet, for the poor in ancient Greece, this watery barley mash could mean the difference between enduring another day or collapsing before sundown. The barley used for kaikion wasn't the fine, fresh grain eaten by the rich. It was the broken, sometimes moldy leftovers, the bits swept from floors or scraped from the sides of clay jars. These would be ground with stone into a rough meal and boiled slowly, watched carefully so it didn't burn. If wine lees, the dregs left after fermentation, were available, they'd be stirred in to mask the bitterness. If not, rainwater would have to do. And if the family had foraged herbs like mint, fennel, or rue, they'd toss a few in, praying they weren't poisonous lookalikes. Kaikion was eaten not because it was loved, but because it filled the stomach. It was the kind of food you consumed slowly, silently, hoping to convince your body that you'd eaten more than you actually had. It was also the kind of food you could stretch endlessly, add more water when guests came, split one bowl between 4 mouths, tell the children it was stronger than it looked, and they'd believe it because they had to. Even the act of eating was different for the poor. There were no tables set with clay plates or polished cups. Meals were eaten crouched by the hearth, with fingers or bits of stale bread used to scoop. Children waited while adults ate first, and sometimes adults pretended they were full, just to let the little ones have a few more spoonfuls. Hunger reshaped not just diets, but families, rituals, and identities. Yet kaikion held a strange place in Greek culture. It wasn't just a meal of poverty. It was also sacred. In the Eleusinian mysteries, the drink was consumed by initiates as a ritual to honor Demeter and Persephone, the goddesses of harvest and rebirth. But the sacred kaikion of the temple and the desperate gruel of the kitchen were not the same. One was ceremonial, the other was survival. For the poorest Greeks, there was no choice. You boiled what you had, flavored it however you could, and gave it a name to make it feel like a meal. The word kaikion comes from to stir, and that's exactly what they did. They stirred hunger with imagination. They stirred scraps with memory. They stirred silence with resilience. And when it was done, they sat by the dim fire, held the clay bowl in both hands, and drank the thin warmth that stood between them and starvation. That was breakfast. That was dinner. That was life. But kaikion was only the beginning. When there was no barley, or no firewood, or no time to boil water, they had to be even more inventive, turning weeds, spoiled flour, and bitter greens into something that could keep them alive another night. And so the next survival food was born not from grain, but from the ground itself. When barley ran short or couldn't be spared for boiling, people turned to what the hills and roadsides quietly offered: bitter weeds, wild herbs, and anything vaguely edible that still grew where the soil hadn't failed. These weren't chosen for taste or pleasure. They were gathered with calloused fingers and silent urgency, crammed into baskets by children and women who knew every patch of earth better than their own reflections. The forests and fields became a hidden pantry, but not one stocked with comfort or abundance, only with possibility. If you knew where to look and what not to touch, you could return with mallow, nettles, wild chicory, dandelion greens, or the spiny leaves of sorrel. Boiled too long, they turned to mush. Left raw, their bitterness scraped the tongue, but there was no room for complaints. Once foraged, these greens were mixed with coarse barley remnants, whatever was left after better flour had been sieved away. Sometimes, even dust and chaff were included, swept from millstones or sacks stored too long in damp corners. To make the mixture hold, the cook would mash the contents with salted water, squeeze it into rough shapes, and press them flat against a hot stone or the bottom of a cracked pan. There was no oil, no spice, no gentle browning. Just smoke, heat, and hope. These rough patties were called maza when baked with barley and greens. The word survives in old texts, usually mentioned in passing, as if the dish were too humble for poetry. Yet for those who ate it daily, maza was more than bread. It was proof that a handful of weeds and a pinch of ash could still become dinner. Mothers learned to trick their children by softening the edges of the bitterness. If vinegar was available, they added a few drops. If there was a pinch of oregano or thyme drying on the rafters, it went in too. Not because it transformed the taste, but because it made the meal feel like something crafted, not just thrown together in desperation. The cooking fire itself was sacred and dangerous. Fuel was precious. Wood had to be gathered far from the village, or stolen from groves that didn't belong to them. Dung was dried and burned, but the smoke was acrid, and the neighbors sometimes complained. Still, the flame had to stay alive, not for warmth, but to give those cakes just enough firmness to be held, torn, and passed around. They were often shared while standing. Just one patty broken into 5 fingers, with everyone chewing slowly, not because they enjoyed it, but because they needed to make it last. The jaw ached from the chew. The bitterness lingered, yet no one left the last bite behind. On rare days, someone found a handful of olives fallen from the tree, shriveled and soft. They'd be pitted with a stone and pressed into the center of the barley cake, like a prize. Other times, someone brought home snail shells or tiny river fish, not to cook as meals, but to flavor the dough with a faint trace of something beyond plants and grain. People began naming the things they ate not just for clarity, but for dignity. A mash of greens became a pie. A scorched lump became a cake. A flat mass of salted flour and weed roots was called a loaf. They weren't lying to themselves. They were surviving with language, turning a handful of nothing into something that could be named, remembered, and offered to others without shame. The children learned these meals before they learned how to write. They knew the sound of nettles rustling underfoot, the smell of burning leaves, the sight of green stains on their mother's palms. They didn't expect sweetness or comfort. They only expected not to be forgotten at mealtime, and when someone asked what was for supper, no one said nothing. Even if there was only 1 patty left and 5 mouths to feed, the answer was always a word, a meal, a moment of strength held together with herbs, ash, and quiet determination. But sometimes, not even weeds could be found. When the hills went dry and the ground cracked open, people had to turn to something even cheaper, something that most would throw away, but the poor learned to turn into nourishment. And so, the next meal began not with plants, but with the cast-offs of the sea. When even the wild greens vanished from the hillsides, people turned their eyes to the sea, not for fresh fish or prized catch, but for the scraps, the slime, and the stench left behind after the market's best had been taken. While the wealthy dined on golden mullet, grilled sardines, and honeyed shellfish, the poor gathered heads, bones, entrails, and scales, the refuse that others would not touch. Fishermen often discarded their unsold catch by the docks, tossing spoiled remains into barrels, pits, or shallow water. These rejects would rot quickly under the sun, but those who had nothing learned to harvest them just before they turned too far. Guts were scraped into clay jars, then buried or sealed with heavy stones to ferment in their own juices. The process took weeks, sometimes longer, and the smell became so strong it clung to skin, hair, and clothes. But what emerged was food. This fermented liquid, called garos, became a lifeline. It was sharp, salty, and nauseating when first encountered, but it offered one vital thing: flavor. With just a spoonful, even boiled grass or tasteless grain became something you could swallow. The poor didn't ask whether it was clean, safe, or fresh. They asked only whether it could keep a body standing. Sometimes the fish scraps were mashed directly into thick stews, boiled alongside onion peels, cabbage stalks, or old lentils. The mixture turned gray, sticky, and pungent, but hunger dulled disgust. It was food that filled the pot quickly and fed many, even if it delighted no one. Children pinched their noses, elders muttered prayers. Still, every bowl was emptied. If someone had access to a marketplace, they might bribe a seller to hand over the week's refuse: sun-dried bones, crushed shells, half-rotten fillets. These would be rinsed in salty water, then thrown into bubbling pots of broth, thickened with crushed chickpeas or leftover barley. No part was wasted. Even the fish eyes, once feared, were chewed quietly under dim lantern light. In some villages, this concoction became tradition, a food remembered by name, shared between generations not out of pride, but necessity. They called it sorrow broth, though it was more soup than anything resembling a real dish. Its scent warned neighbors before it arrived, but it still drew them close, especially in lean years when hunger silenced judgment. Mothers stirred these pots while coughing from the steam. Fathers rationed the salt so the brew would not sour too soon. Infants, too young to chew, were fed the cloudy liquid by fingertip, their cries softening with each bitter drop. No one spoke during these meals. There was no appetite to waste on talk. When food became memory instead of fact, people learned to embrace anything with a trace of nourishment. Garos, thickened with garlic paste, smeared on dry bread, or dropped onto foraged greens, became a form of resistance. The poor might not own fields, flocks, or coins, but they still controlled the flame, the pot, and the silence around it. Even among the upper classes, garos began to appear on tables, now seasoned, strained, and refined. But for those who discovered it out of desperation, it never lost its original taste of rot, resilience, and survival. They remembered what it was before it became fashionable. The sea gave its worst to the poor, but they still found ways to thank it. They made meals out of stench. They found protein in garbage. They created tradition from decay. And once the pot was scraped clean and the hunger pushed back one more night, families would return to their beds, stomachs gurgling, hands oily, the air still thick with the ghost of fish. Yet even those meals couldn't last forever. When the coastlines dried up and the jars of garos were scraped down to their crusted bottoms, people were forced once again to turn inland, to seek strength in something humbler, slower, and softer than salt or rot. And so they turned to lentils. When salt water no longer gave up even its spoiled scraps, and the stench of ferment no longer disguised the ache of emptiness, families looked to the earth again, not to harvest, but to boil. In clay pots blackened by years of use, lentils became the quiet answer to hunger too deep for words. They didn't excite the senses, and they weren't rich in flavor, but they promised one thing that mattered above all: sustenance. Lentils were not glamorous, and they carried no status. Yet for those who couldn't afford wheat, barley, or oil, they were life itself. These small, dusty legumes, red, brown, or yellow depending on where you lived, could last through seasons, hide in sacks without spoiling, and be coaxed into warmth even over dying embers. They needed no fat, no meat, and no ceremony, only time and patience. The cooking began early, before the sun had touched the rooftops. Cracked, worn hands measured out whatever was left, Then rinse the lentils with cold water fetched from wells or rivers. Inside the pot, onions were sliced, not for richness, but for sharpness. Their sting was a reminder that taste still existed. A clove of garlic, if there was one, added bite. A splash of sour wine or leftover vinegar broke the monotony, but when nothing remained, water alone was enough. The fire beneath the pot didn't roar. It hissed and whispered, fed by twigs, dung, or any splinters that hadn't already gone into roofs or fences. Smoke drifted through the cracks in the walls, and eyes stung, but no one moved away. That pot was a promise, not of fullness, but of warmth, salt, and survival. As the hours passed, the broth thickened. Not creamy, not rich, just heavier, the way hunger likes it. The lentils burst softly in the heat, their skins curling into the liquid, turning water into something faintly brown, barely fragrant, yet unmistakably food. When the pot was finally opened, the steam wasn't fragrant, but it meant the meal was real. And for the poor, that was everything. This dish, fakes, was never praised in poems, but it was served more often than any banquet in Athens. It filled more bowls than any goat or fish. It fed the workers who built temples and repaired roads. It fueled the orphans, the outcasts, and the forgotten. Not with indulgence, but with quiet strength. People didn't eat fakes for comfort. They ate it for what it represented, the last line between weakness and collapse. A bowl was passed without ceremony, often shared by 2 or 3. Bread, if it existed, was crumbled over the top. If not, fingers did the job just as well. Children were taught to eat slowly, not because of manners, but because no one knew when the next pot would be made. And yet, in this simplicity, there was a strange dignity. Lentils didn't hide behind spice or spectacle. They told the truth. This is what we have, and this is what we give. Families bowed over the pot, not in prayer, but in instinct, leaning closer to soak in the warmth before it faded. Stories grew around these meals. Some said Pythagoras refused to eat lentils, believing they dulled the soul. But those who truly suffered knew that lentils didn't dull. They protected. They lined the belly. They slowed the panic. They let a man walk another mile, or a mother sing a little longer before nightfall. Sometimes, people seasoned the broth with memories, a tale of a richer past, a whisper of what once was, a promise to eat something sweet someday, somehow. But not all days ended with warmth. When even lentils disappeared from the market stalls and storerooms, people searched for sweetness in the only place it could still be found, among the trees where figs clung to life long after hope had withered. When pots stood empty and fields offered only dust, people turned their gaze upward, not toward the gods, but toward the branches of fig trees whose roots clung stubbornly to dry soil and whose fruit, even shriveled, still carried a trace of sweetness. In times when no grain remained, when no firewood could be found, when no market would sell to those with nothing to trade, it was the tree that saved them, silent, generous, and often forgotten by those who never felt true hunger. Figs didn't grow in wealthier gardens because they were prized. They grew because they survived. Long after other plants withered under heat and wind, fig trees still offered their soft, bruised fruit, sometimes overripe, sometimes crawling with ants, sometimes blackened by the sun. But to the poor, each one was a treasure that needed no cooking, no salt, and no tools to prepare. Just hands, and sometimes teeth worn thin from chewing hard bread. The fruit was gathered before dawn, when the air was still cool and the insects quiet. Women wrapped their skirts to carry more, children climbed barefoot to reach what others had missed, and elders waited below, calling out warnings in soft voices so as not to attract attention from jealous neighbors. Each fig was inspected, gently pressed, and tucked away. Even the broken ones were saved. No softness was wasted. Once home, the families didn't eat everything at once. Hunger taught them restraint. The figs were laid out on flat stones, turned carefully until the skins dried and the flesh thickened. Days later, they were mashed by hand into a dense paste, mixed with herbs or crushed nuts, if any had been found, and finally shaped into small bricks that could last through winter. These weren't desserts. They were rations. To stretch them further, grape molasses was added, a dark, sticky liquid made from boiling down the last of the year's grape must. In wealthier homes, this molasses sweetened cakes and sauces. In poorer kitchens, it was poured over fig paste, binding the pulp together into something that resembled nourishment. This mixture, rich only in illusion, became a kind of ancient energy bar, soft, fragrant, and powerful enough to fool the body for a few hours. People called it Saigon paste, and although the name suggested delicacy, its purpose was survival. Shepherds carried it wrapped in cloth, workers chewed it between long hours of labor, and mothers saved it for the evening, offering it to children as a final comfort before sleep. It was the kind of food you closed your eyes to eat, not to savor, but to pretend. There were days when one piece of this paste became a full meal. A single square, carefully divided, would pass from hand to hand until each mouth had tasted something, anything, that reminded them of sweetness, of life beyond bitterness and broth. Even the smell was enough to lift spirits, to delay despair. But sweetness carried its own pain. Figs reminded people of better seasons, of meals eaten under shade, of laughter not drowned by hunger. And yet, in those moments, memories were useful. They were nourishment of another kind. They made each bite feel sacred, each morsel like a prayer offered with sticky fingers and closed eyes. Children remembered these fig bricks more vividly than anything else. They could name the trees where the best ones grew. At night, when the village quieted and the embers in the hearth dimmed, a single piece of Saigon paste could be shared without speaking. No one said it tasted good, enough that it meant tomorrow still held something to eat. When the sacks ran dry and every grain had vanished, people no longer baked. They scraped, stirred, and shaped whatever fragments they could collect into something that resembled bread. There was no flour in these homes, only the bitter remnants left behind in mill cracks or scattered beneath storage jars. Even dust became precious, mixed with rainwater and hardened fingers to form a crude dough that could be cooked, if not truly eaten. This was not baking as we understand it. It was survival disguised in the form of nourishment. The ash bread of ancient Greece was made from a blend of stale barley husks, spoiled meal, and sometimes even dirt or crushed straw. Anything that could hold shape long enough to withstand the fire. These fragments were pressed flat and laid directly onto embers, often beneath a thin sheet of clay or stone blackened by countless meals like it. The smell was not comforting, but it meant the house was not entirely empty. A fire, even a weak one, even fed by dung or driftwood, was still a sign that hunger had not yet won. The flames whispered promises the meal could not keep, but they offered enough warmth to keep hands working and mouths expecting. Once charred, these hard cakes were scraped from the coals with sticks, the edges burned black, the center sometimes still raw. There was no softness, no golden crust, only a chew that fought back and a taste of soot that lingered long after the last bite. And yet, for many, this was the closest thing to bread they would see for weeks. To make the loaf more bearable, some would grind dried herbs into the mix, not for flavor, but to distract the tongue. Others added onion skins, crushed olives, or old garlic husks, trying to mimic the richness they once knew. Occasionally, someone lucky enough to own a few grains of salt would sprinkle them before baking, elevating the ash bread from merely edible to quietly precious. These loaves were not shared with pride. They were torn in silence, passed without ceremony, consumed quickly before they hardened into stone. Children sometimes cracked their teeth. Elders broke them into fragments, softened in warm water or vinegar if either could be spared. Still, no crumb was ever left behind. The process of making this bread taught a lesson more ancient than myth, that hunger reshapes everything it touches. It turns soot into seasoning, failure into technique, and shame into strength. What began as desperation became tradition. People told stories around the fire while mixing the ash, pretending for a moment that this ritual held something sacred. Some whispered that the gods had once eaten such bread, long before Olympus, when they too wandered the earth disguised as mortals. Whether anyone truly believed it didn't matter. The story was enough to make children chew slower, to make mothers smile despite the black crusts staining their hands. The act of creating something from nothing, of holding up a meal against the cruelty of fate, became a kind of defiance. Each time someone lit the fire, stirred the mixture, flattened the dough, and bent low to place it on the coals, they were saying one thing: we are still here. When these loaves were gone, there was no feast to follow, no fruit to soften the bitterness, no soup to cleanse the throat. But there was memory, of hands working together, of flames rising despite the cold, of something warm in the belly when everything else had turned cold. And when the ashes cooled and the stones were cleaned, people began to prepare for the next day's battle against hunger, reaching not for flour or oil, but for the strongest weapons they had left: raw vegetables, vinegars, and the sharp bite of onion. After the last crust of ash bread had vanished, people didn't look for feasts or delicacies. They searched for sharpness, for bite, for anything that could cut through the numbness that endless hunger leaves behind. In this search, they found something unexpected: the raw strength hidden inside the humble onion and its twisted cousin, the garlic bulb. These were not luxuries, not rare, and certainly not celebrated, but they were powerful. Onions didn't require cooking. They grew in dry soil, needed little care, and could last for weeks in the corner of a cool home. Their price was low, their taste intense, and their effects immediate. A single onion could wake the tongue, bring tears, and clear the chest. Not from joy, but from force. It reminded the body it was still alive. Often, people would slice onions thinly and soak them in vinegar, softening the sting just enough to chew without pain. The mixture became a kind of paste, sometimes mixed with crushed olives or mashed chickpeas and spread across dry bread or eaten directly with bare fingers. The vinegar burned, the onion bit, and the stomach paused, confused but briefly satisfied. Garlic played a similar role. It was stronger, fiercer, almost aggressive in its presence, but it gave the illusion of fullness. When rubbed on a stone or crushed beneath the side of a knife, it released a heat that traveled from tongue to spine. It brought color to pale faces and noise to quiet tables. A clove could be eaten raw, swallowed whole, or steeped in hot water to make a bitter broth that scorched the throat and soothed the gut. These foods were never meant to be meals, yet they became central to survival, not because they filled the belly, but because they stirred something deeper, a refusal to surrender. The poor didn't eat onions because they liked them. They ate them because they gave the illusion of choice in a world where most options had disappeared. Children hated the bitterness. Their eyes watered, their noses burned, their mouths twisted, but still, they ate. They learned early that strength sometimes came in ugly forms, that heat could replace meat, that pain on the tongue was better than emptiness in the gut. These lessons were passed down quietly, with no pride, but no shame either. Onion and garlic also served other purposes. When sickness crept through the village, these were used as medicine, chewed for fevers, rubbed on wounds, boiled for breathing. No one knew exactly why they worked, but they worked enough. And in those dark, uncertain nights, that was all anyone needed. Even travelers carried bulbs tied in cloth, hanging from belts or tucked into satchels. They were cheaper than figs, lighter than grain, and strong enough to make the weakest stew feel like a feast. When boiled with stale wine, garlic broth could revive the faint. When eaten before sleep, onions could silence a growling stomach, even if only for a few hours. Among the poor, there were sayings built around these foods. He who has garlic fears no cold. Bread with onion is better than bread with pride. These weren't jokes. They were truths shaped by centuries of shared need. The rich ignored them. The hungry repeated them like spells. And so, in homes made of mud and straw, beside fires built from scraps, meals continued. Not grand, not rich, not warm, but real. A smear of vinegar, a slice of raw onion, a whisper of garlic crushed onto old barley, and that was dinner. But even these roots could not grow forever. There came times when the soil gave nothing, the stores were bare, and the markets silent. Then people walked back into the wild, eyes lowered, hands empty, hoping the weeds would return, and that boiling leaves and salted water might be enough. When cultivated fields gave nothing and stored roots had rotted, people returned to the untamed earth, not with baskets of hope, but with empty hands and eyes trained to see possibility in what others overlooked. The wild hills, dry gullies, and forgotten corners between stones still held something green, something bitter, fibrous, and nearly flavorless, but alive. These weeds were not chosen for their taste, but for their presence. They grew where other plants refused, defying drought, heat, and time. Dandelion leaves, nettles, sorrel, wild chicory, and other coarse greens became lifelines, not because they offered joy, but because they offered anything at all. They required no seeds, no tools, no trade, only knowledge, patience, and a willingness to kneel in silence while searching. Foragers moved at dawn, guided by memory and instinct, avoiding the poisonous while seeking the stubborn. Bent backs and dirt-caked fingers marked the path of those who harvested not for markets, but for survival. The gathered leaves were sorted, rinsed with care, and dropped into pots filled with water seasoned by nothing but salt, if that could still be found. The fire used to boil them was usually weak, fed by twigs, bark, and dried leaves gathered the same day. Smoke clung to the walls, but the bubbling liquid gave off a scent that, while not inviting, reminded everyone that hunger could still be answered, if only for a short time. The green softened in the heat, turning deep green or almost black, releasing a bitterness that spread through the room like warning, not invitation. This was called horta, a word that survives even now, though its ancient form was nothing like the dish served in modern kitchens. There were no oils poured, no lemon squeezed, no bread on the side, only a bowl of dark broth and wilted weeds, eaten slowly, carefully, with long pauses between each mouthful to stretch the illusion of fullness. The texture was rough, the flavor metallic, the color unkind. And yet, people swallowed, not because they expected satisfaction, but because they understood what that bitter warmth meant. It meant their bodies could continue moving, their children could continue growing, and their homes could remain upright another day. Sometimes the broth was drunk after the leaves had been eaten, served in shared cups that passed from hand to hand without a word. It was thin, barely warm, and salted just enough to prevent disgust. And in that moment, it was everything. There were rules around these meals, though no one had written them. Never boil too much. It will draw attention. Never throw away the water. It holds what little strength the plant had. Always share, even if there's only enough for one. These were not suggestions. They were lessons learned through hard winters and harder silences. Even the children knew how to harvest. They could name plants before they could recite numbers, could spot edible roots from meters away, and could chew through bitterness without grimacing. This wasn't training. It was memory carved into their bones, passed down from those who had lived through worse. Occasionally, the bitterness was softened with a single crushed garlic clove or a splash of old vinegar. But those additions were rare, almost ceremonial. Most of the time, the dish remained bare, unchanged. Its plainness a reminder that flavor was not the goal. Survival was. In these bowls of weeds and salted water, there was no shame. There was endurance, sacrifice, and a quiet pride that came from making something where there had once been nothing. People didn't ask for more. They simply gave thanks that something green still grew, that firewood could still be found, and that hands could still hold a spoon. When the weeds stopped growing and the last roots had vanished, people didn't search for food. They searched for memory, for warmth, for anything that could replace what had finally disappeared. In these moments, Meals no longer came from earth or sea, but from ritual, illusion, and quiet acts of defiance against despair. Hunger had already taken everything it could, yet somehow people continued gathering at the hearth. The pot was still placed above the fire, even if nothing lay within. Water was poured slowly, with care, as if the act alone could summon something more. Flames danced beneath an empty vessel, crackling softly, pretending to do what they once had done with real ingredients. A pinch of salt, if any grain still remained, dissolved into the silence. Sometimes, even that gesture was mimicked, fingers moving over the pot without releasing anything at all. Children watched, confused but trusting. They didn't ask what would be served. They had learned long ago not to question the kitchen when it fell quiet. Their faces turned toward the steam, which rose gently from the boiling water like a ghost of the past, a scentless, formless echo of meals now buried in memory. Mothers ladled the broth into bowls as though it carried weight. They simply handed it out, one after another, as if it were the finest stew they'd ever made. The children cradled their bowls with both hands, drawing the heat into their chests, closing their eyes to feel more than they could taste. These were called hope meals by some, not in mockery, but in quiet reverence. They were meals made not of substance, but of presence. They held no nourishment, yet they offered something else, a fragile structure that held families together even when the world around them had crumbled. People needed to believe they were still capable of preparing food, even if the food itself had vanished. Sometimes, herbs were dropped into the water, not to flavor, but to remind. A dried leaf, a broken stalk, a single sprig saved from better times. These additions changed little in the pot, but transformed the atmosphere around it. The meal became a story. It became a link to years when the table had something real upon it. The bowls were lifted to lips. Sips were slow, intentional, reverent. The warmth filled mouths, throats, and lungs. Not enough to satisfy, but enough to interrupt the ache. Hands held ceramic edges longer than necessary, just to keep the illusion alive. Nobody asked for seconds. Everyone knew there was none. Even the act of washing the bowls afterward felt sacred. Clean water was hard to spare, but they used it anyway, honoring the moment as if the broth had been real, as if the hunger had been fed. The pot was rinsed. The embers were buried. The floor was swept, and the house was quiet again. These meals were not recorded in cookbooks, not carved into stone, not passed down through recipes, but they were remembered. They were remembered in bones that once ached, in eyes that once stared at steam and saw salvation, in fingers that once stirred water like it held the world. The tradition of pretending, of protecting others from despair by acting as though nothing had changed. That was the final meal. And still, people endured. They endured with empty bowls, with silent chewing, with dreams layered over water. They endured because the fire kept burning, the pot kept waiting, and the hands kept moving. Even when there was nothing left to eat, there remained something deeper, the refusal to fall apart. In the heart of ancient Greece, the true cuisine of the forgotten was never olive oil or honey. It was this: thin gruel, bitter weeds, salted air, and meals made from memory. Food that didn't feed the body, but kept the soul from breaking. That was how they survived. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.